Look, this is very serious. Yesterday, I spent the whole programme talking about this. Overnight, we've had the second night of airstrikes, the US pummeling the Houthis in Yemen. The American forces launched a second night of airstrikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen. This was early, actually, this morning. The US military said it struck a radar target near Sana'a, the Yemeni capital, at about 3:45 a.m. local time. That's 12:45 a.m. GMT. Witnesses reported intense air activity above the city, and the Houthi TV channel Al Mazira reported that the Al Dalami airbase had been attacked. Now, the US has said this is follow-on action on a specific military target. Mike, let's start with you. My personal feeling on this is that, and we've talked about it earlier this morning, really the West, the coalition, had no option. They had repeatedly warned the Houthis to cease and desist. Those were the words. Do not attack all these ships. As I keep saying, 15% of global trade goes through the Red Sea and into the Suez Canal. 30% of container ships go through there. There is a real impact to people in this country and around the world. So they really didn't have much option, because if they had failed to follow through, it would have been hollow promises.
It would have been, and I think, look, the fact that Britain has played a leading role alongside the US and other European allies in assisting in these strikes, and it's very much a supporting role compared to the sheer weight of military force the United States can bring to this, is to Rishi Sunak's credit. But in a sense, he's boxed in on this domestically because, of course, he's just seen, at the end of the year, his target inflation pledge fallen. The price of oil this week hit at least $80 a barrel. Indeed. Of course, that's just one example of a global supply chain, a crucial global commodity there that passes through that key geography that could have been disrupted. If he wants to keep on target and keep people's cost of living low at a time of intense geopolitical instability, he has to act tough on this as well. But also there's a certain element of, this is the first time that British military forces have been committed to new action since 2018, and it's an opportunity for him to make his mark as well. But the geopolitical pressures and the need to stand alongside the US, even though, as you pointed out, we have had limited military resources compared to the US to do so, was an essential step for him to take.
Yesterday, I think it took us all by surprise, actually. It had been brewing for a long time. I was very struck by the considered response from the West. So we had all of these governments, Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, the UK, US, putting out this broad statement talking about a consensus. They'd been weighing this up for a long time, hadn't they?
They had. And I mean, obviously it all comes through the prism of the Israeli operations in Gaza, which I suppose is partly why it all has to be very measured, because there is the concern that because the Houthis have sort of come out to bat quite so vociferously for Hamas, that any sort of additional military action might be seen as in some way an addendum to that conflict as well. So you can understand why it was rather measured, because in order to sort of perform a military operation like that, you'll have to have had the permission of a number of other Arab states in the area, be it Saudi Arabia, be it Egypt, if nothing else, just to use their airspace. So it did have to be very carefully done, and part of the problem with Yemen is the Houthis have come to power across almost half of the country through a very brutal civil war. A lot of people have died, many more are suffering as a result of that. It's one of those things that we've sort of very flippantly looked on in the West and gone, oh, the Arab coalition are committing war crimes, they're the bad guys, and these poor rebels, they're not. And then you think, oh, actually, no, look at what they're doing, they're boarding ships in the Red Sea. How on earth did they get helicopters? And you realise, actually, it's a very important part of the proxy conflict that has been going on between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran for a very long time. So it is a delicate situation, because these are the allies of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They are part of its web of proxy groups. So we do have to be sort of cautious. Not that I think Iran is about to get involved, but still.
So was the Prime Minister right to order action after the National Security Council meeting after Cobra, taking that action without recalling Parliament? There's a lot of, well, I think that he's right.
It's a load of nonsense. This whole Parliament has to be consulted. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't have to be. It's a royal prerogative.
Well, let me ask you, Mike, then, what did you make of the fact that Keir Starmer agreed, and then he said, well, actually, it's really important that we debate it in Parliament? Those two things don't actually come together.
The timing of these operations can't be dictated by the sitting hours of the House of Commons. Look, Gordon Brown debated giving Parliament the right to sign off on military action. This is one of the key reasons, actually, why I believe it was Italy said that, according to its constitution, it couldn't take part in this as well. We must also notice that France didn't take part, but did issue a strong condemnatory statement of the Houthis' actions. So the Western coalition is not completely aligned in this. It's interesting in a wider geopolitical context. Of course, we've got the elections in Taiwan taking place this weekend as well, and there's a big question now about whether or not any unilateral declaration of independence there would escalate conflict further in the Far East as well. So there are multiple flashpoints now happening across the globe. One of the tweets you read before talked about World War III. I mean, if there was a World War III, they'd be blinking, we'd miss it due to the sort of sheer use of nuclear weapons in that. But it is interesting that we are living, as Benedict says, in an increasingly complicated multipolar world. And even now, the traditional units of nation states, if you look at a sort of a broad map of the territory allocation inside Yemen, the west of the country is broadly controlled by the Houthis. You know, there's patches of sort of Al-Qaeda. It's like a bizarre weather map. And then you've got the government forces in the east. But even that's more complicated on the ground. Reading that there was no civilian casualties from the assessments made by military intelligence from the UK and the US was, I think, a welcome development. The tricky thing is what happens in the next step as well, because the Houthis aren't going to de-escalate because of this. So we're kind of back to that classic sort of Jed Bartlett West Wing thing of he and Liam are carrying on.
And that's the point I made to Asher. What next? Do we just sit
exactly,
back and
yes.
wait?
So is it going to be more proportionate strikes here? Is it going to be a simple escalation of deterrence? We have to ensure that we, as the UK, have the sufficient defence capability to protect shipping lanes as well. We can't just rely on the US as well. And of course, the bigger context of this is if President Trump wins re-election later this year, there's going to be big questions over the stability of NATO, which is still a cornerstone of Anglo-Atlantic defence.
So you mentioned that Iran doesn't want this to escalate, and yet these are Iranian-backed militia, so many of them. What is Iran's modus operandi here?
Iran can't get involved itself. That's why it funds these organisations.
Yeah.
Happy for that to escalate. It can't get sucked in itself. Iran
isn't it getting sucked in?
Militarily, it can't.
No, indeed.
Iran
but
can
isn't
win.
It getting sucked in when you've got people like Grant Shapps telling them to make sure they cease and desist and tell their proxies to back off?
Well, how are we going to stop them? How are we going to make them cease and desist? It's very difficult to stop them from providing weapons and financial support. There are other mechanisms by which we can do that, but we're not going to send troops into Iran to seize their resources. So actually, it is one of those things where it's a bit of saber rattling. It's us going, now you have to behave, much like the Iranians are saying to the Israelis, no, now you have to behave. Everybody is very aware in the situation that Iran can't get sucked into a conflict. It would be able to fight an invading force to a standstill. Iran is a much more difficult country to try to conquer than, say, Iraq was. But that doesn't mean that it's in a position to deploy troops itself overseas, which, again, is why it funds other organisations, other groups, to do its bidding. So it's one of those sort of things where we're all sort of sat around saying now everybody has to be very careful about what they're doing. The key player in all of this is the United States. The United States is the one that can do whatever it wants, whereas Iran has to sort of rely on other groups, and we have to rely on the United States.
Do you think it's focused our minds in this country about how important our military deterrent is? Because when you look at the fact that we've got these brand new aircraft carriers, we can't even send the HMS Queen Elizabeth over there because we were talking about this. They can't actually crew the support ship, the RFA Fort Victoria. I mean, that is a nonsense.
I don't think we're focused enough on it yet. I think recruitment is a massive issue in this country, but it's also a massive issue as well in the United States.
Well, we were advertising on LinkedIn.
Well, one of the things that's happening in the United States, I'm not so sure if it's happening here yet, but one of the things happening in the United States is a real difficulty recruiting or retaining white working class people, because they feel that it isn't actually a thing worth doing because of all the push for everything to be diverse. And then we had in the Telegraph the other day Grant Shapps saying the military needs to be more diverse and more representative of Britain. And you're sort of sat there going, that's not really what it's for, is it? It's there to sort of kill people. That's ultimately what it's about. And I think that is partly why you are having a recruitment issue. It's not very well paid. It's very hard work. And if we're being honest, traditionally, where do you hire people from?
Danger.
Well, traditionally, where do the soldiers come from? They're white working class, and if they're being told no, actually the promotions will go to almost anybody else, and you are just going to be a grunt for the rest of your life, which the odds weren't particularly great to start with, but that's your lot. What's actually going to incentivise you to go and sign up to fight and die for an organisation that's beginning to start telling people, diversity is more important than your ability to kill people?
It's a brilliant point.
Well, it's a brilliant point, and Jane Ferguson makes it online, actually, saying our armed forces need to stop using DEI, which leaves straight white males who we really need at the
so
bottom of the...
DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion.
And inclusion.
Not equality.
No,
Sorry, yes.
equity.
Yeah.
Straight white males at the bottom of the oppression Olympics. And nobody wants to be in the Olympics if they feel they're always going to be at the bottom. It's a brilliant point.
I think, so, I mean, but also, I said we're not taking it seriously. Let's not say other countries aren't as well. I mean, Japan had a pacifist constitution that forbade it from deploying troops overseas, forbade it from having nuclear weapons, all these sorts of things. It now, as of the last few years, has changed its constitution to say, oh, actually, yes, we can have nuclear weapons on our soil. We can deploy overseas. It has standing reserves and active personnel of 300,000. That's almost 3 times as many. And it's a pacifist country. It's taking these things seriously. It also has a huge plutonium stockpile that it's decided to start putting together because it recognises that you can't necessarily rely on NATO or the United States for your own self-defence. Other countries of a similar, comparable size to us, are beginning to take it seriously. It does just seem to be us and Germany and France who sort of sat there twiddling their thumbs. I mean, even the Italians have spent a huge amount on their naval forces because they've recognised, the dangers that are coming across the Mediterranean from the migration flow, but also Russia's influence in the region. So it is very important. And, you pointed out Donald Trump might become next president of the United States. He said several years ago, NATO countries have to start pulling their weight because we won't always be here to bail you out.
Mike, how worried should we be?
I think we have to recognise that the UK has strengths in areas like military intelligence. Intelligence and security information sharing are the bedrock of security in the 21st century. I think we're very good at investing in things like cyber, but on issues like manpower, we are falling behind. And it is under this government that they have decided to cut regular forces down. But when you look at time and again, for example, at the resources we're deploying to Ukraine, Rishi Sunak, of course, was in, meeting with President Zelensky this week.
He was in the back of the car when he authorised the strike.
2.5 billion in military aid to there, but we're also seeing difficulties in, we're talking about the funding of proxy groups there. The equivalent in the West is, the funding that's going to Ukraine. We've seen stalling in the EU through Hungary blocking the EU's funding package. Congress is holding up Biden's latest attempts, or was until very recently. The issue then becomes, if we are not going to be on the pitch in terms of trying to defend liberal democratic values globally, then we have to expect that the kind of non-state actors that act on behalf of more hostile state actors, China, for example, Iran, to name it just 2, are going to have their influence grow. But I think what this action shows is that the US government, the Biden administration, the Sunak ministry here in this country are still prepared to take proportionate action to defend crucial global supply chains. How far they are willing to go, though, and how far they can go in an increasingly complicated and incredibly hard to navigate region is going to be one of the key foreign policy challenges of the next 12 months.
So it was interesting. I didn't know this until I read it this morning. At 7:45, the Prime Minister hosted the Cabinet meeting using a secure line in the back of his official car when he disclosed RAF Typhoon fighter jets were poised to carry out military strikes. Now, he didn't tell them when those strikes would come. In fact, they'd already taken off and they were already in the air. Now, you mentioned Ukraine and the 2.5 billion, and we're the first country to sign up to this new defence pact with them. What does this do for Rishi Sunak? Well, there were a lot of cynics yesterday saying this is Rishi Sunak's Thatcher moment, that actually it changes his standing in terms of the election and people are seeing him as a world statesman.
Well, I think let's look back at a sort of comparable example when Donald Trump authorised airstrikes against Syria, and that was seen at the time, at the time his foreign policy was, divisive, but actually it was seen as a very strong example of, particularly given the America First agenda, that he was, not wanting to commit to truth, but he was prepared to use American military hardware overseas. And a lot of conflicts, we are not so much now, we're not talking about ground invasions here, we're talking about deployment of special forces, UAVs, we're talking about airstrikes here, using technology here, but it doesn't replace the need for troops on the ground. This isn't going to transform Sunak's prospects, but what it will do, I think, if he's prepared to continue to keep the shipping lanes open, is help him at home with his key domestic pledges to keep inflation down, to keep cost of living down, because ultimately disruption to global supply chains for key supplies is going to hit our pockets here. And also, we have to be aware that this is not an issue that's going to go away in the next 12 months. This is only going to get worse, I would say.
So finally, can I just ask you, do you think the public is waking up to actually the threat that we're under and that defence is important? Or do you think it's still far, really way down the agenda when you look at cost of living, for example?
Well, cost of living is related to all of these things. It's related primarily. A lot of that was kick-started by the war in Ukraine and the impact that had on energy prices and food prices. So if that didn't wake people up to it, I really don't know what else will. I think Yemen is slightly too far removed and slightly too abstract. What role the Houthis actually play, what role the Suez Canal plays. That's not to say that people are not understanding it. It's that bit further removed from what we were all focusing on was Israel and Gaza, and now it's kind of like, oh well, why are we getting involved in Yemen? So I do think that people are more aware of it, but actually I think if Ukraine didn't do it for people, this isn't going to change people's minds, I don't think.
Mike and Benedict, thank you very much indeed for the moment.